Well, good evening. I'd like to welcome you tonight to yet another Pender Talk. I'm Reverend Will White. I'm the lead pastor of Pender United Methodist Church, and we're located at 12401 Alderwood Drive in Fairfax, Virginia. And we certainly hope that when this situation we're in with the global pandemic is over, you'll drop in and join us for worship. Well, tonight we're continuing some of our pandemic-related talks with a special presentation. This is the third of our three-part series. Tonight's presentation is going to be on pandemic-related trauma and grief. And so, as with all of these presentations, I thought about my own personal connection with this topic. And as I think about trauma, I'll let Ellen, our specialist tonight, provide definitions. But when I think about trauma related to this pandemic, I remember growing up in elementary school and getting dressed up to go visit the United States Capitol as a child in elementary school. And what a big day that was for us. We went into the basement of the Capitol building, and our teachers had written ahead, and we met one of our congressmen. I believe we met a senator too, and they each gave us a little speech. And it felt as if we were doing something important, that we were in an important place. And of course, on January 6th, there were some events that occurred that we all saw on television, I think. And, that really did bring up my fond memories as a child of being in the Capitol building, and what a sad thing that was. And it was actually very upsetting for me to watch that. So that's one way in which trauma has affected my life. Another way that trauma has affected my life during this pandemic has to do with a lot of the racial unrest and sadly racial violence that we have witnessed during this pandemic. More recently, that violence was related to Asian Americans in the events that happened in Atlanta, Georgia. But prior to that, it wasn't so long ago that we were also talking about George Floyd and events that occurred related to African Americans. And those are things that we can't unsee if we witness those events on television. Very upsetting and traumatic events. When I think about grief, again, the expert will talk about the difference between trauma and grief. But when I think about grief, I think about some of my own experiences during this pandemic. Some of the restrictions that were placed upon us for the performance of funerals as clergy. And I won't go into them because I don't want to add to your grief during this time. But some of those restrictions were very upsetting and not only bothered me as a clergy person, but also some of the families. So we had to do things differently. But then some of the funerals that family members had to go through together during this time, they weren't allowed to go to. And that's certainly the case in my own immediate family. There were, more extended family, there were two uncles who passed away during the pandemic. I wasn't able to go to either of those funerals as well. And graduations also have been a source of grief, I think, for a lot of people. I have a son this year who's graduating from college, and it's unclear whether or not we'll be able to go visit him on his campus, and whether that graduation will actually be held in person. So that was something we were looking forward to. And so that's been my engagement with grief during this time. Well, we're going to hear from an expert in a moment, and I'm sure you have your own experiences of trauma and grief. But before we do, I'd like to invite God's presence into our gathering tonight. God, of course, is already here. And I want to begin with a reading from the book of James, chapter 5, verses 14 and following. Reminds us, are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them. So at this time, I invite you, wherever you happen to be, to please join me now in prayer. Let's pray. Almighty and everlasting God, who can banish all affliction, both of soul and body, show forth your power upon those in need tonight, that by your mercy they may be restored and may be able to serve you afresh in holiness of life and living through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, it's truly my privilege this evening to introduce to you our guest speaker tonight. She's none other than Ellen Hart. Upon graduating and completing her master's degree from VCU, she became a licensed clinical social worker and also a therapist. And professionally, she has been a part of the counseling services department at VCU, where she provided counseling for VCU undergraduates as well as medical students from the Medical College of Virginia. But more recently, Ellen has been in private practice. She works with families and adolescents, particularly adolescents who are struggling with addiction. And also, she's my big sister. So I'm very glad to have her with us tonight. And we're going to hear her presentation in just a moment. But before we do, I hope that you'll have questions for Ellen tonight. And I want to invite you to enter those questions into the chat. Please use the chat feature tonight. Now, I may have to break in on Ellen's presentation a time or two to remind people of that, but I want to encourage you to enter those into the chat. And I'll be monitoring those chat features, and that at the close of her presentation tonight, we'll have a chance to ask her those questions. I'll rephrase them for you. So rather than using the raise hand feature of the Zoom webinar, we ask that you enter those questions. We hope you've got them. Enter those into the chat and I'll rephrase them. So at this time, it's my pleasure. I want to hand things over to Ellen.
Thanks, Will. I really appreciate it. It's really an honor to be able to come before a group of people that are seeking God during this time. I mean, this is really hard stuff. And in my practice as a therapist, I've been doing a lot of telehealth, a lot of things that have changed, and a lot of trauma and difficulties that people have been going through. And I will be honest with you, when I sat down to do this, I thought, no problem. It's going to be great. Easy peasy. You know, I talk about trauma and grief all day long. It'll be fine. But as I started to pull this together, I started having a lot of feelings. A lot of feelings of my own grief that I just don't think about when I'm helping other people. And so I hope that tonight that, I promise you tonight, we will have to touch on some of these difficult things. I'm not going to dive all into all of them. And there are some, images of some stuff that's happened. None of it, I don't think, is going to be triggering for anybody. And no spoilers for Wanda Vision. So I promise to keep it simple. So towards that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started tonight talking about pandemic-related trauma and grief. So there's a lot going on here, and we are living through what they say are unprecedented times, and it's really true. People have not had to deal with the things that we've had to deal with. Here we go. Definitions of grief and trauma. Grief is the response to loss, particularly the loss of someone living that has, or some living thing that has died, to which a bond of affection was formed. And, I want you to sort of think some living thing, there's lots of living things in there that have died or ended. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. And these things are different a little bit, but they're also very, very similar. I'm going to show you how they're similar. Trauma is that overwhelm, and grief is that missing, that hole in your heart. And grief is traumatic. and trauma triggers grief. So they're deeply related, but this is the official things we're going to go through. So the grief and the trauma, you know, often when we talk about grief and trauma, we're like, those people out there have grief and trauma. But right now, everybody on this call and everybody watching later on YouTube is experiencing grief and trauma, because we've all lived through this year together. Not since 2001, September 11th, have we had corporate multidimensional losses in the way we've had them this year. So we've had our hospitals, you know, our nurses look completely different from what we're used to our nurses looking like. Our hospitals looking different than what we're used to them looking like. Hold on. We've had the loss of businesses. The Fortune magazine reports that on the onset of the pandemic, 140,000 were marked temporarily closed on Yelp. By August, that number had fell to only 65,000, but that dip was not entirely driven by businesses reopening. Instead, many just went under. More than 97,966 businesses have permanently shut down during the pandemic. And this is a local Richmond place. I'm from Richmond, that I'm going to miss very badly. Here's a loss: weddings, graduations, funerals. This bride smiling in an empty church filled with just the pictures of her loved ones. It's a beautiful picture to me because it shows you all the love and the support that so many people really do have for this couple. But it must be so quiet and eerie to walk down that long, long aisle alone with just your father. There's also been culture wars, really difficult things that we've seen happen in terms of people getting along with other people. I've found that people that I have always gone to church with and loved and taken care of, people in my family, have had losses and separations. You know, people talked about how difficult Thanksgiving was after the election. And you have families where people are changing and growing, and other people that are like, this is not okay. I don't like this. And so there's lots and lots of things. We are mourning the death of moderate politics in this country. When you look at the different polls, moderate politics is sort of smaller and smaller and smaller, and people are more polarized. And those people who are polarized are having a harder and harder time getting along wherever they may work together, at work, at church. Here's a loss for me, a big loss. I don't know if you all know who these guys are. This is Bo Porter and Dan Kolko. And yes, Masson got rid because there were too few people watching, because interest in baseball had gone down. The teams were losing money. Masson got rid of Nats Extra that came on before the Nationals games. And that is a huge loss for me. But it is a real loss. That's only kind of a joke. I love Bo and Dan, and I was heartbroken. I watched Bo and Dan in the summer every night before the game, just to stay up with it, and then watch just a little bit of the game. And then, to be honest with you, pop back with Bo and Dan at the end of the night if I'm still up, and you know, they would put me to sleep at night, and I'm going to miss them so much. Another thing I'm going to miss that's pandemic related are my white jeans. I had the cutest pair of white jeans last March that I bought to go on a trip with my family, and I definitely cannot fit into them anymore. So my white jeans have been a cat, you know, from a loss because of too much sourdough bread. So another pandemic thing. So as you can see, these losses come in so many levels, everything from the deaths in the US, 540,000 worldwide deaths. We have 2,810,000, which is mind-blowing. These are from today. I looked them up today. Big losses that we can't even imagine. I can't wrap my mind around either of those numbers, all the way down to my poor white jeans sitting hopefully in the bottom of my drawer, hoping that someday I'll be able to fit back into them. So when we're talking about trauma and grief, a lot of times I think we focus on thoughts. Now, tonight's evening is overlaid. So we're going to overlay Will's knowledge of Jesus at some point. We're going to overlay a little bit of brain chemistry and things like that. And we're going to incorporate both of those into my field, which is therapy, and just functioning and managing the good times and the bad times in our life. So in order to do that, it's really helpful to have an understanding of the brain, because the brain is like a piece of meat in between your ears that has all kind of chemicals running back and forth in it all the time. And if you understand how those chemicals work, some of our inexplicable behaviors become, oh, well, of course that's what happens. I'll give you some background here. Here is a map of the brain. We've got our prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking center of the brain. That's where your logic is. That's the part of your brain that has to be lit up if you're going to make a logical decision or be able to think through a complex problem, like prioritize. All of that kind of information is up in here. The anterior cingulate cortex sort of monitors your emotions. It also regulates them. It sort of switches them off and on and back and forth where you're going to be focusing. And right here, this yellow, this little itty bitty yellow thing, this is the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. And when we're in grief, we've done, or trauma, honestly, we've done brain scans. So this is the regions affected by grief. Trauma is also going to affect some other areas involving language. So we can't always access language when we've had a traumatic event. But this right here gives us a picture of the grief. This is so trauma and grief. So trauma involves the prefrontal cortex for sure, the language center, which is up here, and the cingulate cortex. So trauma is going to involve those. I want you to look where those are. Those are all up in here. Down here, we have your brainstem, and all of this stuff right in here. These are where you have the little engines that keep telling your heart to beat, stuff that you don't really think about. If you had to have a thought every time your heart beat, you would die, because you just can't think that fast. Come on, beat heart, beat heart, beat heart. Your brain just doesn't do that up here. So none of that happens up in here where your language and your reasoning is. But it happens down here very close to where your fear switch is. And that's because this also involves all of your automatic movements. So let's say a car is coming at you at 50 miles an hour and you're crossing the street. Here comes your car. So here's our traumatic event, right? The car is coming at us 50 miles an hour. Our brains are designed so that when we see that car coming, all of this shuts off. So you can see in this picture where it says it's underactive. All of this language, underactive, it all just goes blank, shuts off. And this right here takes over. not so that you can move, right? So have you ever been stopped by the police and just you can't talk, you can't say anything? You're just like, sorry, officer. Whoa. It's because your amygdala right here is all activated, and it shuts off the power to all these other parts, because it is the important thing. It's the thing keeping you alive. And so our brains have kept us alive. Our brains have kept us running from saber-toothed tigers, right? Which was very helpful. But now in our modern times, we kind of need language when we're in trauma or in trouble, but our brains don't know that yet. Our brains just shut it right off with that amygdala. So this is how a brain affected by trauma and a brain affected by grief is wired. Guess what? My brain, as I sit in front of you tonight, is wired this way as well, because I've been through trauma and grief this year. Your brain is wired this way as well right now, because you've been through trauma and grief. And I'm here to tell you, everybody you meet, every store clerk, every teacher, their brains are all, the chemicals swashing around between their ears are all a little off right now. And so I hope that makes things a little more understandable to you in terms of what might be going on with you or with those around you. So we can't cover grief without looking at the 5 stages of grief from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, I am sure that most of the people on this call are going to be really familiar with the 5 stages of grief. And they were recently dramatized very, very amusingly in a show that was very popular on Disney Plus called Wanda Vision. Wanda is one of the Avengers. Now, if you don't know the Avengers, I'm just giving you a little warm walkthrough. Wanda's one of the Avengers, and her main love interest was Vision, who was a synthesoid, which means like kind of robot, part robot. And Wanda Vision and synthesoid were, Wanda and Vision were very close. So Vision is his name, Wanda's her name. Wanda and Vision were very, very close and were passionately in love. And Wanda had to kill Vision in order to save the universe at one place. And then it didn't work. She made this huge sacrifice. And this is all Avengers, so I hope I'm not spoiling things there. Made this huge sacrifice and came back and then had to watch him be killed again a different way because time was so she saw him die twice. And as WandaVision opens, we see Wanda in black and white TV land. Wanda is in Leave It to Beaver land. It's all black and white. She's in a wedding gown. She's with Vision. Everything is hunky-dory. So it starts off with Wanda in the denial stage. Vision's not dead. Everything is fine. We're all going, how did Vision get there? But we don't know yet. Next, the next stage is anger. At one point, somebody starts to question Wanda, like there's a few things that aren't really adding up around here. Wanda gets very angry for the first time, and she uses her power, and the person who questioned her, she sort of blasts her out of the TV world so that she was just exited the TV world. And up until that point, Wanda's been very even keeled and very, very nice. Bargaining. This is the scene where Vision and Wanda are now. So they've also moved through the decades. So it's the 50s. Here's the 60s. Here's the sort of 70s, 80s. They're together here, and Wanda's bargaining with Vision. Then Wanda does some things that she regrets after the bargaining phase and falls into a depression. And here she is in the 90s. Finally, Wanda comes to acceptance, loses Vision again, and but it is with a lot of growth and with a new path in front of her. So that's the 5 stages of grief, which you've probably seen a lot before.
Yeah.
Now, there's some critique of the 5 stages of grief. And, grief doesn't always go to plan. So a lot of times now that we know these 5 stages of grief, thanks to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, we sort of expect our grief to match that stage. And when grief is not going to plan, sometimes we get negative reactions, especially from some members of the Christian community. So this is all of our what not to do thing. I had a close friend who has really been through it in 2020. Her brother, who was her closest friend, died of cancer, and she got COVID at Christmas, all within 2 weeks of each other. And these were things I'm glad I didn't share with her during that time. And I don't make it up that people share these things, because there is a wonderful book that I will definitely have on my resource sheet by Kate Bowler, who is a president who was a professor at Will's alma mater, Duke University Divinity School. She is a history professor there, and she did a history on the prosperity movement. Also taught other classes for Duke, wrote a book on that, and then was diagnosed with stage 4 at the age of 35, stage 4 colon cancer, and was given a short period of time to live at that time. She's beat that. She's still alive. She had a 2-year-old at the time, and she wrote a book about her experience. And these are the sorts of things that she said people from the Christian community tended to share with her when she was in grief. Since we're all in grief, you'll know not to do this. They would send articles like 5 peculiar things God will do when he wants you. 4 signs God is telling you to block someone. 3 confusing things God will use to reveal the one. 4 signs God is preparing you for what you've been. And crazy things God will let happen to 5 crazy things God will let happen to you, so you will. I don't want God to do 5 crazy things to me. That's not going to cheer me up, people. What's going to cheer me up? How are we going to walk together with this? Here's a line from Kate Bowler's book. The pain of the world, when people were interacting with her in that way, is being calculated according to some. Compassion is only doled out by the teaspoon. And we don't want that to be the body of Christ, or just anybody. I don't want it to be me, for sure. So a critique of the 5 stages of grief. Number 1, denial. People say when you're in denial, then you can't move on to the other stages. We know now that's not quite true. Denial is actually helpful. And think about that brain chemistry. That's why I started off with brain chemistry. If those chemicals truly accepting and truly processing the loss of somebody that you love so much, or that job that you don't have anymore, or the changes in your grandchildren's life compared to what they were before versus what they are now, those things would be too painful. And your brain chemistry would not be able to manage brain health with all those chemicals. And so denial is kind of a natural way of your brain just taking a break. It's sort of wiping those chemicals out for a little while, and then you come back to it. Lesson 2, grief can shake our faith. I think we have this thing like, okay, well, I'm going to go through this hard thing for a reason, and I'm going to come out stronger. That's not how it feels while you're in it. You may feel that way in 10 years, but don't try to jump yourself or anybody else to the end of your story. Grief can shake your faith. First place I want you to go with that is to your friends in this body and to other people who will just say, yeah, this really sucks. This is terrible. And we understand how that happens. It shakes your faith on lots of levels, right? Your faith in society is shaken. Your faith in your community is shaken. When I see people, so for me, it was really important to wear masks. And so when I would see people wandering around that I kind of knew and liked without a mask, I was like, oh, I don't want to know that about you. Do you know what I mean? I want to feel like you care. So my faith in the community and the good spirit of the community was shaken. And then my personal faith on me, am I going to be able to handle this? Can I make all these transitions? Can I work from home? All of that happens when you're going through grief and trauma on all those levels. Lesson 3, grief usually leads to acceptance. This is my trust the process note. Grief is going to get you there. You may not go right through the 5 stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You may dip back into denial every once in a while, but that doesn't mean you started at the beginning of your grief journey. That just means you dipped back there for a brain break and you're coming on out. And you're going to make it. You're going to get to acceptance. You just need to just trust the process. It might be slow. Now, David Kessler, who did a lot of the work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, recently developed the 6th stage of grief. And let me read some notes for you. Let me see if I can find. Okay. So the 6th stage of grief. Kessler's insight is both professional and intensely personal. His journey with grief began when he was a child, and he witnessed a mass shooting at the same time that his mother was dying. For most of his life, Kessler taught physicians, nurses, counselors, police, and first responders about end of life, trauma, and grief, as well as leading talks and retreats for those experiencing grief. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and helped develop the 5 stages of grief. Despite his knowledge, his life was upended, the sudden death of his 21-year-old son. How does a grief expert handle such a tragic loss? He knew he had to find a way through the unexpected, devastating loss in a way that would honor his son. And that ultimately was developing the 6th stage of grief. And for David Kessler, that's meaning. Each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint, but what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point to the silver lining. It's really important. Don't try to point somebody to the silver lining ahead. Just be there with them. Make them a cup of tea. Have some yogurt. Another one that David Kessler found in this book that he wrote after his son died. Your loss is not a test, not a lesson, not something to handle, not a gift, nor a blessing. Loss is simply what happens to you in life. Meaning is what you make happen. So now we've had grief and loss, trauma. Any of you that watched, and I made sure I didn't watch because I'm a therapist, I knew what it would do to me. Many of you watched George Floyd's death on YouTube. I tried to look it up today just to see how many views. Over 6 million people watched it. And that's only one of the places that it got uploaded. So many of you experienced firsthand the traumatic death of somebody in front of you. So you've got it, folks. You all have been through it with me. And now we have the pandemic and the isolation and the things that does to our brain chemistry and to the way we think and do things. So I'm not going through all the changes with the masks and the hand sanitizer and all that we went through last year. I'm going to talk just briefly about late stage pandemic effects. Now, of course, we've only been in a late stage pandemic once, and so these things are developing. This is not from a peer-reviewed study, but these are things that people are noticing and starting to study now. Symptoms of late stage pandemic effects. So not only do we have trauma brain, we've got this going on. We're forgetful. We're feeling foggy about goals and directions. We're struggling to identify pleasurable activities from the before time. We have a sense that we really aren't in the after times yet, but the before times are fading. Many of us are rethinking major life choices, but with little information about what the after times hold. We're facing economic uncertainty. We have worry. We've got concerns about getting vaccinated and wondering when it will be safe to plan something. So late stage pandemic is a completely different thing. So see how nice you all need to be to yourselves. Look at all this. Look at all this your good brains are doing. They're being so good. Y'all are all here on a Wednesday night. Good job, people. So how do I do that? How do I make meaning out of all of this? Especially when my brain is all foggy. You just told me my brain is all foggy, Ellen. How am I supposed to make meaning now? So Stephen Hayes is one of my very favorite psychologists, and he's really one of my heroes. He created acceptance and commitment therapy. And this is one of his quotes. As human beings, and he's talking about how our brains tend to function, especially when we're trying to get those frontal lobes online and the back of our brain is not wanting to cooperate with putting energy up here. As human beings increasingly look inward, life begins to seem more like a problem to be solved than a process to be fully experienced. The problem with problem solving is that it's a mode of mind that doesn't know when to stop. Just think about how rewarding it is to dwell on our problems. We feel like we're getting something done. We're not enjoying ourselves too much, so we feel like it must be kind of productive, right? It's fake. It's very rewarding, but it's fake. All that trying to solve problems all the time, that's not going to get us to meaning. So how are we going to get to meaning if that's not going to work? How do we move out of the problem and into the solution? Viktor Frankl knew something about trauma. He was in a concentration camp and afterwards wrote a book that's still a classic, Man's Search for Meaning. And in his book, he proposed 3 ways that people can achieve meaning: through creating or completing a particular task or work, through an experience or interpersonal connection, and that this sort of conceptualization that pain and suffering are unavoidable. So Lifton studied both survivors and perpetrators of wartime evil and focused on the idea of symbolic immortality. We are all mortal, and we must face the prospect of an inevitable death. As a result, one way we cope is by seeking out symbolic immortality, or a way of living even after we die. Lifton proposed 5 ways this path can be reached: having children, focusing on links to the past and the future through our physical matter, like something that, like creating a garden that's going to still be there when you're gone. Turning to spirituality or religion, digging deep into your church and your church family and the people who can support you here. Deciding to live each moment to the fullest possible experience, and emphasizing the impact of one's work, mentorship to others, and creative output. The role of creativity in finding meaning is both explicitly stated and implicitly found in many other components of both Frankel's and Lifton's conceptions. So notice when we talk about having children, focusing to the links to the past and the future, turning spirituality or religion, deciding to leave each moment to the possible the fullest possible experience, and emphasizing the impact of one's work, mentorship, or others. All of that has a creative bend to it, right? So having children is creative. Focusing on links to the past and the future, that draws us to do things like scrapbook or look up our genealogy. When we think about turning to spirituality or religion, you've just got this rich history of art and music and food, all these wonderful things in the church. Deciding to live each moment to its fullest possible experience. You have to sort of figure out a way to enjoy it, often involves creativity, and emphasizing the impact of one's work, mentorship of others. That means you're looking for something unique. Again, you've engaged your creativity. Creativity can help people reach significance in many ways. Most strikingly, the act of being creative is enjoyable all on its own, regardless of any specific outcome. Consider this guy. This guy's name I can't pronounce, so I made sure it was copied right. But I think probably most of you here have heard of the concept of flow. Flow is that time, if you haven't, when you're doing something and you're doing it and you look up and it's 3 hours later and you're like, where did the time go? That was fun. That didn't feel like 3 hours. That's an example of being in flow, in which one is actively engaged in a pleasurable pursuit. If you ever saw a 7-year-old play Minecraft, there's an example of flow for you. One way to enhance coherence is to engage in what's often called the writing cure. So here are some concrete things. You can do the writing cure. And this process, as these guys wrote it, entails writing expressively several times a week about personal, emotional topics. The writing does not necessarily need to be creative in nature. It could be journal keeping, for example, but it needs to have some element of a narrative. And the reason why it has to have narrative in it is that we're trying to get out of the back of our brain, right? And into the front of our brain where our logic and our language are. And by writing, what's happening is that this part has to calm down. This part gets, because we're also walking around, think about it, people, our judgment is not good right now. We're all walking around and our judgment is like, we're all like a bunch of idiots because, the amygdala's sort of hijacked everything. So by writing and getting it all out, you're engaging with whatever memories come up, whether they're the traumatic ones or whether you just want to write about, the thing you made yesterday. You're writing, you're calming down your amygdala, you're creating something that will last if you want it to last, or something that you can burn later if you're just trying to organize your thoughts. It also creates what we call a trauma narrative. So it creates a cohesive trauma narrative, which is the story that you can carry with you to organize these difficult, multifaceted losses. Living a life with such pleasures is a way to enhance significance. So you can also do art making and creative works. And you guys have been doing these things. I've been seeing them on Facebook and everything. I just want to give you a quick example. This is a piece of cross stitch that was designed by somebody. This is just my weird interest, but it was designed by somebody and given away as a free pattern, and a British crosswork designer designed it. And she named it Pandemic, and she gave it away free for the month of April, I think, in England. And then it became very popular. Now you have to buy it. But lots of people did it. It's a big work, and it takes a gazillion hours to create. And this is somebody who just recently finished theirs. But I want you to see how people didn't, so what happened is that she did this and then people started tweaking it and she was like, yes, go, you all tweak it, put whatever you want in this. So here's this big thing, but do you see right here? Can you see that, Will?
Mm-hmm.
The toilet paper roll.
Toilet paper, oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah.
So this fancy piece of cross stitch and they
Yeah.
put the toilet paper roll in there. So people started putting things that had been traumatic and reorganizing them into this beautiful sampler. Here's another example. This one's from Britain. And this guy right here, they took another, there was like little people like this in the original pattern, and he put a nurse and a doctor and a caduceus here and says, our heroes. And right here, somebody also, a symbol of loss from the last year. You recognize who that is? RGB.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
RGB. See her collar? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They put Ruth Bader Ginsburg into their needlework. And this one is from a cross stitcher who is stitching in Australia. And in Australia, they had this devastating fires on top of the pandemic. And I wish I had a bigger picture of it. I could only find this little one. These are tornadoes that they had. Here is a little Australian animal. I don't know his name. This right here is a koala. You can't quite see. Here are some flames for the fires. And here is a kangaroo. And so she took the same piece of art that I was just showing you, and she incorporated all those animals into her piece of art. And here is a piece of art that people did in protest and in pain. When George Floyd died, somebody created an art projection and projected it on the Robert E. Lee statue, and it became a symbol for.
That's in Richmond, right, Ellen, on Gray Street?
That's exactly where that is.
Joe doesn't live very far from there.
And just lit it up so that every night it was lit with this, and there were several other light pieces of art that were put on there. So people are, they're sad and mourning George Floyd's death, but they're creating this art piece that gathered people around it. And here are a bunch of ordinary people painting Black Lives Matter into the street, which was sort of a creative thing that started and then spread to many different communities. And in some communities, people just made it happen themselves. So there are some of the ways people have been doing it. So there you go.
Hey, thank you, Ellen. That's, an excellent presentation. I didn't expect anything less from my big sister there. Thank you for that. Really good job. And I want to encourage you, if you have questions for Ellen, to enter them into the chat. I'll be scrolling through there and compiling some of them. But I want to follow up on a couple of things that you said. That our chemicals are all jumbled up at this time in our brains, and that causes the actual logic and the maybe the better parts of our brain, the parts that we're more proud of, to have less influence on some of our behaviors and actions, and we're actually retreating into that fear center in our brain at this time. And what are some examples of can you maybe name some examples of the kinds of things? I was thinking about that as you were talking.
Absolutely. There's lots of examples. I mean, my first example is the toilet paper scare of 2020, right? People know how much toilet paper they use. They don't use that much toilet paper, but people just went into fear mode and grabbed all the toilet paper off the shelves that they could find. So that's an example of if they had been thinking and planning and they said, okay, I need toilet paper for maybe a month, 2 months, there would have been enough for everybody. But some people just, took ridiculous amounts. I mean, I hear people still have toilet paper a year later. And so that would be like an example of like being hijacked by fear. Another thing is this other tendency to numb out when that center gets too activated, right? So when our amygdala is really activated, it's going to feel really good to have a glass of wine, right? And we're seeing a lot of people getting in trouble with drinking. So, and that's, you know, adolescents as well as adults, the isolation, the fear, it's like that drink feels really, really good. And your front lobes are telling you, yeah, we don't need that. It's, you know, it's fine. It's only one, but the back of your brain is saying, no, 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 I want more, I want more, I want more.
Oh, yes.
And I'm dealing with a lot of parents right now that have been, and so then often in a family system where we see that maybe is that the children are numbing out too, and they're numbing out with electronics. And so the kids are numbing out and trying to calm their amygdala. And I'm all about calming down your amygdala, people. Let's all calm down our amygdalas right now. Like, we can do that together. But we pick, maybe because of our frontal lobes being off, we pick less healthy ways to calm that center down. And so then you have me not fitting into my white jeans, right? Because I calmed my amygdala down with some sourdough bread. And it'll be a while before I'm fitting back into my white jeans.
Yeah. So other behaviors would be sort of like perhaps some anger, other things, you know.
Absolutely. Irritability, anger, definitely you see that.
A little less, I guess, sort of being able to monitor our behaviors, keeping that needle in the middle.
Right. And you saw what it did to the political climate and the things that people said to each other in social media, right?
Yeah.
Really hard stuff.
Yeah. People's not much moderation in what people are saying sometimes, I think.
No, I don't mind sharing. You know, my mother-in-law thinks very differently than we do politically, and said stuff. I mean, I've been around 35 years and my mother-in-law has never said some of the just mean things. Like, she said she didn't think I was a Christian anymore. I mean, really, like, it's because she's afraid. You know what I mean? And I just went, okay, I'm still a Christian. I'm going to church. It's good.
Right.
We're gonna be fine. You know, but it just, everything got so, you know, polarized. Then the language increased the fear. You know, many of us were looking at the amount of fear we were seeing after the election among people whose candidate did not win. And then there's this idea that maybe the election was stolen. Some sort of violence seemed kind of inevitable in some ways. So it's grief, but it's people, and you know, they're like interviewing the people, like, oh, they're the nicest people, whatever, and they're the people that stormed the Capitol. Their fear center just got wagged out because they were so afraid of what would happen if the other candidate won, that it meant that their logic and reasoning centers were not functioning properly, and people that had great careers and lots of money got on planes and broke into the Capitol building, and now they're in jail, you know?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Ellen. Now, you know, you're talking about the grief process, and I think I really like what you said about the 5 stages. And if I can get that right, so, you know, instead of like thinking that it's a linear thing where you're moving from one stage to the next, it's really more like a tornado or a cyclone, where you kind of end up at the end with acceptance, where, okay, it's anger this moment, you know, it might be bargaining another moment. And yeah, there might be some progressivity to move down to that road of acceptance, but it's, you know, it's not, we're at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.
Right, exactly. And nobody's doing it wrong. You know, I think that's the thing, I think that was the problem with the 5 stages. And, you know, what my message to everybody tonight is, whatever stage of grief you're in, you're not doing it wrong. Just keep going.
I found it really interesting that you mentioned that your language area is kind of shut off when you're retreating into the fear sections of your brain. And you know, that's very interesting. That is very interesting. You know, I got my vaccine, and I've been saying I'm a little bit foggy since I got my vaccine. Maybe it's not the vaccine, maybe it's that tail end of pandemic, as you talk about.
I think a lot of people, I felt very foggy after my vaccine. So I have to say,
Okay.
I will join that. I did, I was pretty foggy,
Okay.
but I'm still happy to have it. So no complaints.
Yes.
But this fogginess is real. And I'm seeing it in children that just can't remember to bring their stuff. I see it in college students that are, doing virtual school exclusively now, going on their second year, I see it, and it's just a different kind. People have gotten over the Zoom fatigue. I think people can tolerate sitting in front of the computer screen for a lot longer now and talk. But what I see slipping is just that executive functioning, that organization.
That's important, I think that's something that, as this has gone on, there's more and more of that, I think, happening with people. So this I know that pandemic fatigue hasn't gotten into the DSM or anything like that, but definitely we're all experiencing this chemical jumbling that you're mentioning about. I really love the Wanda Vision. My son, I have a son that would just really love that you use that, using that as an image. I was very interested in what you said about meaning, that there were kind of three things there to kind of help. One was completion. Can you help me remember what the others were?
Well, I'm going to have to go back to my slides so I get it right, because I don't want to, misquote Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, because the idea of completion, that's something that I know during this pandemic. If I make my list, okay, I got that done. I feel so good to get that done. But the idea of moving to meaning in all this, I think, is really a significant idea. So if you want to share your screen to bring that back up.
Okay, hold on. These are not my prettiest slides, so I'm not as fond of these slides. Hold on. Okay. Oh, I always, every time I do that, let me just get through. Sorry, guys.
Well, I appreciate you doing that.
No problem. I can pull them up. Okay, so Frankl said creating or completing a particular task, and how he explains it is that when he was in the concentration camp, he kind of he started off thinking about he survived. And some of the people that survived or did the best day in and day out were the people who were like, I've got to get back to my farm because I've got a little patch of land where I like to do sunflowers, and I'm going to get back to my sunflowers. And I didn't quite get that done. I have to go back to my farm and finish it. There was that kind of thread of qualitative information that he sort of gathered while he was in the concentration camp. So this idea that I have to finish that. Also, that's why I picked that massive sampler that these people are attempting. That is so many hours, that sampler. I showed you a completed one, but it's like this big.
Okay.
And people have just been, that is a good thing to keep them going, because a lot of these people are in England. They've been through major lockdowns. They can't find floss, so they're substituting different weird colors of floss that they have sitting around for the different colors. But they feel like they got to finish it, and it gives them something to do while they're not able to go to the stores.
So the interpersonal connection. So during the pandemic, do you have thoughts about that? I mean, how we can do that, or is that?
I think it is. I think that is the biggest one. One of the things I had trouble with during this is I had to think about ways that I haven't maintained interpersonal connections during the pandemic. I've maintained some of them. I've got to say, but there was one or two that I thought of, and I thought, man, that's not like me. Like something bad happened to somebody that I don't see hardly at all anymore because of the pandemic. And I literally blocked it out, just forgot. And I had to go, oh my gosh, sins of omission. Like, I should have done something for them. I mean, I would have been doing really nice things for them, but they were just absent. So I think that's the hard one, and we have to stay mindful.
Stay mindful about that one. You know, that pain and suffering are unavoidable. However, there is sort of an attitude piece to that. You know, we don't want to say, well, you're not saying, okay, pain and suffering are unavoidable, so let's just wallow in it. It's kind of like the idea actually developing a plan is a good thing, you know?
Right. And what I like to do is I like to say thank you to it. Because that pain is telling you something. You know, I don't have time to go. I could go a lot longer than this on psychology stuff. But Stephen Hayes, who I quoted earlier, one of the reasons I wanted to quote him is that all of his work talks about creating a healthy relationship with suffering.
Right.
And that suffering is just with us, right? And so how do we thank it? How do we move with it? Not even push against it. I think that as Americans, we have this idea, because we've watched a lot of media, that happiness is the normal state of man.
Yes, right.
And Stephen Hayes says no. It's like suffering is a little bit more normal. So what are we going to do with the suffering? And how are we going to thank it? How are we going to welcome it into our lives and not sort of condemn it to being bad, or there's something wrong with me that I'm suffering? I think that's the biggest problem, is that we start to think there's something wrong with us because we're suffering. But there's nothing wrong with us. Suffering is what happens.
You know, you're doing so great. You're answering a lot of the questions that actually have been submitted, but I want to kind of, why should somebody spend time contemplating this? What are the consequences of unresolved trauma and grief?
I think that the biggest thing is, okay, so I think there's one thing that I think is fake, is that, like, if you stuff it all down, it has to come back out as anger. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of a fake sort of pseudo psychology that comes in. What I see it is, you have to integrate all the parts of yourself, the part that's in pain, the part that's having joy, the part that's sad, the part that's angry, integrate them into one person. Is it work? Yes. But some of that work can be fun. Like I told you, do something creative that you just like, that you get in the flow of, even if it's a video game, a little bit of video games. And, you know, that helps integrate all of it.
So, you know, a little amateur artwork, or
amateur artwork, journaling is so good for you. It is so great to get that, because you're putting your language back into play. So
as you were saying those things, I was thinking, you know, one of the things about my job that is actually very good is that I have the opportunity to put together a sermon every week. So I get to kind of try to connect with myself each week through that. And sometimes I draw pictures of things to help people understand concepts. And I find that those are, you know, they help me, actually the activity in doing that. So that's really good. So the idea of trying to say, this is something that's just happened, and, you know, it's unavoidable, but, you know, we want to move to meaning through all this. We want to find the meaning. And so, you know, completion and finding interpersonal connection and recognizing, you know, unavoidable pain and suffering, all this is kind of, these are steps to move us to meaning. Some of the other questions in the chat I want to look at, this is someone asks, even though many of us are vaccinated and wear masks, we're still anxious about socializing. How long should we anticipate feeling the way that we feel?
If this was longer tonight, that other thing I was going to talk about is the other side of this, like moving out of the pandemic and how stressful that is. We've just in some ways gotten into it. I did mention that we're kind of in this no man's land now. Moving out of it is going to be another series of stressors, and you're going to just have to take care of yourself. Tell your brain, they're there now. Thank you, fearful hyper brain. The CDC tells me that now, because I'm vaccinated, I can be without a mask, with my grandmother who's also vaccinated, for instance, and I can actually hug her. And you may have to access that language to tell yourself and thank your brain for being all anxious, but say, I'm going to be fine. I think it's going to be more of a challenge than we anticipate.
Coming out of this.
Coming out. I think a lot of people have gotten used to being at home. I think a lot of people are going to not necessarily feel comfortable until they can totally be sure that nobody's going to infect somebody else. I have clients who have not left their house in a year.
Yeah. Well, and also one thing that I'm seeing, and I kind of want to talk in generalities because I work, I'm a pastor and I work with people in a congregation, but, I do notice people sometimes making rather drastic life choices right now. And maybe, moving away or things like that, decisions that are right now. I would think, having listened to your presentation, maybe now's the time to take a deep breath before you make huge, big, life-changing decisions.
I think that there are two things happening there, Will. I think you're right. One is that people's inhibitions are a little, on some levels, some things that they might have been more afraid of approaching, that would involve their logic centers, right, are weakened, and they're doing big changes. I do think that there has been, in some people, increased self-exploration and self-examination. And for some people, the COVID being at home hasn't been so bad, and they really have grown and moved and changed and see a new direction and a new hope. We have all this new technology. We can work from wherever now. So I would say that, just because somebody's making a drastic change right now, it doesn't necessarily mean their front limbs are not helping them out.
All right.
Because of the new opportunities and technology that's come out this year too.
Yeah.
So I would say it can go both ways.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Ellen. It's time for us to wrap up, but I am very thankful for you coming out tonight and discussing this with us. And wonderful presentation. And these notes are going to be available on the church's website, and so you can look at them later. And also, Ellen, you are in private practice as a therapist, and so if you want to give everybody your email address, you can do that right now.
Yeah, it's just ellenhart@outlook.com.
Okay.
All lowercase.
Okay, ellenhart@outlook.com. Hey, thank you, Ellen, for your work tonight. I really do appreciate it. Excellent presentation. And let me pray for everyone, and then we'll depart tonight. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the presentation this evening, and we ask, oh God, that you help us to work through this time that we've been in, that was not a time of our choosing, this pandemic, and yet one with which we need to cope. And lead us, oh Lord, to the place of meaning, that we may come through this in your time, oh God, to the place that you call us to be. So help us to be watchful and to be aware. We pray in Christ's name, amen. Thank you all once again.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for being here tonight.